You're listening to Foreword, a podcast from faculty at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, hosted by Michelle Knight, Josh Jipp, Madison Pierce, and James Arcadi. Foreword invites listeners into the mission of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School through conversations with faculty, staff, and guests.
Hey Madison, what's going on?
Hey Josh, how's it going?
Oh, I'm pretty good. How are you?
Good. I'm great. Thanks for asking.
Okay, good.
You know, Josh, there's something I wanted to talk to you about today. And actually, I've been waiting for quite a while because we haven't gone to host together in a while. But as you know, I'm a huge fan of your work.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes. I'm waiting for the punchline. Thank you. Thanks
I am.
So much.
I'm a huge fan of your work.
Madison.
So, I try to read what
too.
I can. And I try to listen whenever you're on podcasts.
Oh no.
And
okay.
you've done some really great interviews lately. But there is something that we kind of need to work on.
You're making me nervous. Okay. Yeah.
Because you are on a podcast. You host a podcast. And I noticed
with 4 people, it's like I'm a quarter host, basically. Yeah.
Okay. We can give you more responsibility. Do you want to do more?
Administrative stuff or more like talking?
Either.
No, I don't. I'm good. I'm good right where I'm at. I think I'm in my sweet spot.
Well, so on Eric Roseberry's podcast on biblical scholarship, he asked you, Josh, do you have anything you want to promote? And then he was like, don't you have a podcast? And you were like, oh, yeah, I do have a podcast. We'll play the clip. Curtis, can we play the clip?
Dr. Jipp, thank you so much for your time today. Anything you want to plug or let people know about? I think there's a podcast, right?
A podcast. You're a part of? Oh, our Foreword podcast. Yeah. Yes.
Madison Pierce was the first guest ever on the show.
Out. Yeah,
so she was pushing it.
Yeah. Can we edit this so it sounds like I'm actually really plugging our podcast? Check us out. Forewordpodcast.com. Madison Pierce, Michelle Knight, James Arcadi, Josh Jipp.
Okay, so there it is. So let's practice this again. Josh, do you have anything you want to promote?
I do. I'd really love for you all to get involved in subscribing to this wonderful podcast called Foreword, a TEDS faculty podcast. And you can subscribe on iTunes. You can, I don't know, I know there's a lot of places on the internet where you can subscribe. You can leave reviews. You can tell your friends and your neighbors. And you can also donate money to us. So, for example, if at any point you feel like this podcast is so great, why not send us $5 in the mail or even just a Starbucks gift card? Foreword, a TEDS faculty podcast.
Yeah, I'm glad we practiced this. Yeah, that's good. And by the way, if you do, for some reason, decide to take him up on this, audience, and send money, do not address it to Josh. Address it to Foreword.
I was the one that just made the plea for it. You don't have to do money. You can do gift cards, Amazon,
Buffalo
Wild Wings. Dick's Sporting Good is like, I would love. Anyway, anything you can think of. I'm as the kids like to say these days, I'm here for it.
Oh my goodness. You make that look so difficult. Josh, is there anything you want to promote? Yeah, I'm on a podcast. Check it out at forewordpodcast.com.
That's all you were going. I don't know. I feel like you wanted me to do more than just say check it out at forewordpodcast.com. I've never been to our website. We have a website? Okay.
Yes. Okay, well, you know what? I think it's a good idea that we talk to Andy. Today, we've got Andy Abernethy in. Let's get him in here.
Am I in trouble? Am I going to? Okay, yeah. Let's get Andy on the show. Hey, everyone, and welcome to Foreword. I'm Josh Jipp.
And I'm Madison Pierce.
And today we are privileged to have with us Dr. Andrew Abernethy, Associate Professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College. Andy received his Master's of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, as well as his PhD from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And we're so happy to have him on the podcast with us today. Thanks so much for spending some time with us, Andy.
It's great to be here with you, Josh and Madison.
Now, Andy, I want to hear a little bit. I think our listeners would love to learn a little bit about how did you get to be where you are, sitting in your office as a professor at Wheaton College. Tell us a little bit about your vocational trajectory.
Yeah, you know, I tell my students that I'm an accidental academic. Like this is me sitting in an office as a professor is very unexpected journey for me. And when I was in college, I was not following the Lord in my first few years, partying my brains out, not going to class. One semester, I got a 0.8 GPA.
That's probably not easy to do.
I know. It's like, how did you do that? How did you get a D plus in one of your classes? You know, I still don't know how I got that D plus. But then I turned to the Lord and ended up going to a liberal arts Christian college and just started reading the Bible out of desperation to know the Lord. And I would never have thought of the Bible as a vocation, certainly not to be a scholar and teacher of it. And pretty soon, though, I started feeling a call to minister God's word. And for me, that meant going to seminary, and I ended up at TEDS. And, you know, I met this guy named Josh Jip, who, when I was there at TEDS, and we lived in the quads together, right, Josh?
Yeah.
Do they still have that? Do they still let students live in those quads?
They don't. They look pretty. They look pretty bad. Yeah. But I still sometimes go down there and walk around and just think about the good old days with people like you and Felix Theonagraha, and just Those were great days. They should turn that into a museum of sorts. Like, especially your room, the Josh Jip's room.
Oh my goodness.
So
let's get it back to you here, Andy. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Here we go. So at TEDS, I loved studying at TEDS with great people, and I was really inspired by Dr. Willem van Gemeren. His teaching in the prophets was just those disciples on the road to Emmaus, their hearts were burning as they talked with Jesus. That's how I felt when I was in Van Gemeren's class. He had a way of opening scriptures that helped you encounter God and to help you think theologically about the God that these texts are bearing witness to, and how they bear witness to Christ. And that kind of lit a fire in me. I had already been loving the Old Testament and as well as Hebrew. But there was a little seed planted in the back of my mind that if I ever go and do a PhD someday, I want to do it in the prophets. I took a call to be a high school youth pastor at a church in Indianapolis, and that was right when I was finishing my MDiv. And Dr. Van Gemeren and I had a conversation. He encouraged me. He said, you really should do a PhD someday. And for me, I didn't have this kind of master plan of, I want to go on to Harvard someday, or I want to go study with this or that scholar. To me, it's like I had everything I needed in Van Gemeren. I wanted to be like Van Gemeren. I wanted to. The guy would walk around with this Hebrew Bible open. Did either of you have classes with him?
I had one.
And he would just. He was like a rabbi. He would just walk around, and half the time you couldn't understand what he was talking about because he was just on this different plane. But he'd bring you into this world of the text, and then all of a sudden the dots start connecting, and I loved how he interpreted Scripture with a careful eye towards Scripture, but also connected to theology. And to me, it was, wow, if I could study with Van Gameren, I would be all set. And I came to TEDS and really had a great experience studying. Unbelievable student. In my PhD cohort, we had a student from Burkina Faso who's now in Cote d'Ivoire, African Yakuba Sanon, who's now heading up the African Bible Project. I mean, an unbelievable person that was in my cohort, and others. May Young is now at Taylor University. Libby Backfish is at William Jessup. Jill Ross is on faculty at Liberty. Ingrid Farrow, who's been at TEDS and at Northern. So just a great group. And I had a great time studying at TEDS. And I took a job at Ridley College while I was finishing my PhD down under with Josh Jipp's best friend, Mike Bird, right? So, I need to hear more backstories about
I don't want to say
friendship.
he's not my best friend, but he's more like my pen pal from 20 years ago. So.
Okay. You guys have, he talked quite regularly about you, Josh.
We carried on together. We carried on like a 5-year email conversation about no, Pistis Christus this, Ergonamu that, so yeah. I love Mike. Yeah. Mike's great.
I actually need to jump in here because you going to Ridley is a part of my story too. Because Andy, you and I met when you were at TEDS also, but in a different capacity. Right. You were my Hebrew professor, but only for a semester because you got this opportunity and you left us behind.
I did leave you behind. Madison was a great Hebrew student, and the odd thing about Australia is, not odd, it's more so compared to the U.S. educational system. They start their school year in really February, so they go based on the calendar year. So I had to ditch Madison and her group. So
some abandonment issues here, I can tell.
Yeah. So if I had stayed, Madison, do you think you would be an Old Testament scholar, or were you already on track to be a New Testament scholar?
I think I was thoroughly corrupted by that point. But, that's despite your best efforts.
Okay, that's
you were
fine.
A great professor. We really did miss you after you were gone.
Yeah, it was fun. Yep.
I've heard Madison share just how good of a Hebrew teacher you were, Andy. So I know she's being genuine here.
Thank you.
Can we talk? I'd love to hear a little bit about your work. I've read 2 of your books, but I never read, I think, your published dissertation, which had to do on food in Isaiah. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's right. Just give us like a minute or two. Like what's something that we would like all be better off for knowing about the theme of food in Isaiah?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I guess I'll throw 2 things out at you. Often we miss the grounded reality of our faith. And what I mean by grounded, our faith being anchored in a material world, even though obviously we hope for new creation. And we don't often think of promises like the whole book opens. If you're willing and you obey, you will eat the good of the land. For most of us, our bellies are full. Maybe we had some anxiety during COVID, whether we'd get food or not. But this was a time when the food supply was depleted and there's a dependence on the Lord for food. And the book ends by declaring, "My servant shall eat." So this idea of God being this giver of food through the land is kind of this recognition of God being the one through whom this food is coming, and his servants will be able to enjoy it. So I would throw to that. The other thing I would say, I did not expect to get into how much food was interrelated to imperial discourse. And what I mean by this is if you're an ancient army and you're going on a campaign, when do you go on a campaign? You go during harvest season, so that the people that they didn't have like big supplies of refrigerated food for their troops, And these ancient empires used the destruction of crops and food as a way to say who's really king. Sennacherib's king, look, we're going to destroy your crops if you don't give in to us. We're going to cut down your trees. But on the other hand, kings also would use feasts as occasions for really showing off and displaying who they are, their power, their generosity. You think of feasts like you see in Esther or Daniel, where it's this big display, and it really frames for me Isaiah 25, which has this great vision of God hosting a meal. And you see God kind of as king hosting this meal, and these meals show what the king is like. And guess who's at the meal? All nations. He's giving them the richest of food, and he's swallowing death for them himself, and so the way that meals can kind of portray kind of a social theological vision of who God is as king, I think was a bit unexpected in the way that fit into discourse at that time.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Are you better off for knowing that, Josh?
I think I am. Yeah. No, I think I am. And it's kind of a small, maybe an obvious statement, but I hadn't thought of Isaiah 25 like the metaphor of, I know like death being swallowed up, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of like God, and it says all the nations will eat and will feast on this, but I hadn't connected it that like God's the one that's swallowing death. So that's just an interesting thing I'm thinking about. Cool... That you So I'm better off, I think.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and Josh, he really likes food, so
hospitality, right? You wrote on hospitality,
kings.
We have a lot in common, Josh. What were they feeding? What were they feeding us in the dining hall at Ted's when we ate a lot of the same stuff, but we ended up in different testaments.
Yeah.
Oh goodness. Well, along those same lines, I think I have two questions. One is, I'd like to hear a little bit about the new project that you and Gregory Goswell did on the Messiah. But before we get there, we've talked already about your work in Isaiah. That book is on the horizon, but then you also do have the Festschrift for Dr. Van Gemeren. So what are the threads in your work that you think are dominant?
Wow, that's a great question. So I wrote Eating in Isaiah, and what that thread is a literary approach to the book of Isaiah, how to read the book as a whole, attending to its literary flow. And from there, I wrote the book of Isaiah and God's Kingdom, which gave me the opportunity to be more biblical theological. We're closely reading Isaiah, again, with the more of a literary interest in mind, but being able to ask now canonical questions. How, when we read Isaiah, has it been structured to bear witness to God? And I suggested God's kingdom is a nice way for holding together what the book's doing. But I also, within there, had actually the chance to mention the name Jesus. Madison, you'll be glad about that. Because, of course, when you're doing some dissertation work, and, my dissertation's published by Brill in Old Testament studies, you can't go there, really, especially when you're trying to contribute in contexts like SBL and so forth. But I don't view that work I did on Eating in Isaiah as defunct. It's just more would, in my view, fit into a larger interpretive project where you could build on that. And so for what the book of Isaiah and God's Kingdom allowed me to do was to say, well, how do we read these discrete witnesses to who God is as bearing witnesses to the same God that we profess as being made known in Christ? And so I would kind of position my thread as a concern to listen closely to the text, allow it to speak its own, kind of sound forth with its own discrete voice in a way that bears witness to Christ. And so I was able to develop that. And the Festschrift for Van Gemeren, what title did we settle on? I need to find that. Interpreting the Old Testament theologically. was a chance just to get others to contribute to this project and honor really the legacy of Van Gemeren. He was a theological interpreter way ahead of his kind. And if our audience hasn't had a chance to read the chapter in there by Kevin Van Hooser, where he contrasts Walter Moberly, who you probably know quite well, Madison, his work with Van Gemeren, and kind of brings them into discussion as theological interpreters. So I'd say that's where my heartbeat is: close, careful readings of texts and being able to ask those bigger theological questions. And if I could just talk about a book that's going to come out this summer, I wrote a book for a series that I think should get more notoriety than it does. It's called Discovering Biblical Texts. I don't know if either of you have heard of that series, but Anthony Thistleton wrote one on Romans, and Ian Provan wrote one on Genesis. But what they asked, I didn't think I ever wanted to write an intro book on Isaiah again. I felt like I'd already written that in the book of Isaiah and God's Kingdom. But what this series requires that you do is you integrate historical backgrounds, literary studies, and reception history.
Wow.
And that was a really cool project for me to do. And so I engaged with voices from Martin Luther King Jr. to some liberation theologians, to artists, to musicians, and then all the way through the whole gamut of Christian interpreters throughout the centuries, and trying to wrestle with and trying to present a vision for how to read Isaiah as what I would say as Christian scripture. So it was a wonderful project, and that should be coming out this summer. So yeah, those are kind of the threads I'd say, is that concern to try to have discernment as we read text carefully and think theologically about what we're reading.
That's excellent. Thanks, Andy.
So Madison's other question, tell us more about God's Messiah in the Old Testament. Why write this book? Why wasn't the scholarship on the Old Testament good enough before you and Greg wrote the book?
Yeah, well, I think Greg asked me to write the book with him, I guess, is one answer.
Boring. Come on, let's get to like what
the bigger answer is this. This is the big question students often have in mind. Okay, when I read the Old Testament, they'll hear things like everything in the Old Testament is about Jesus. Everything, and while in a tempered way, I would affirm that everything in the Old Testament is about Jesus, but they're expecting to see every passage somehow fitting into this mold of expecting a king and a hope for a king, like a human or like a messianic king figure. And once they start reading the Old Testament, they're like, there's not that. They're like, where is all this Jesus stuff, And I had a hard time knowing where to direct my students. You have the more critical scholars who would just kind of say, you don't really have any messianic hopes in there. And Fitzmyer and others would kind of point in that direction. And then you have other works, which I don't want to name any names of other scholars who've been good works, but kind of what they do is they kind of hop from promise to promise, and they just kind of deal with a couple verses here or there. And I think in the process, they miss kind of the fullness of the way the Old Testament is bearing witness to a future king. So for instance, what might be messianic about 1st and 2nd Kings? Mm-hmm. Okay, you're going to have a hard time finding in there a promise like, unto us a child is born and a son is given. You get that in Isaiah. What's messianic about 1st and 2nd Kings? Well, can you ask a larger question of, once 1st and 2nd Kings was finished, there was no king on the throne.
Mm-hmm.
And as you look at 1st and 2nd Kings, there's a certain ideal of what the kind of king that Israel needed is portrayed, and how it's written, that what we argue is built around kind of a Solomonic and Josianic idea. Like the kings are talked about in a way which would lead to a kind of ideal of, oh, here's what a good king would really be like. And then the book ends with Jehoiachin getting elevated to the table of a Babylonian king. And you just wonder, oh, maybe God is going to remain committed to the line of David. And so I think what Greg and I tried to do is offer a treatment of the Messiah project, which is willing to kind of look at some of those promise passages, but also raise the question of how these larger narratives are portraying an ideal king as well. So we take more of a book-by-book approach, which I think makes us distinguish, to trying to hear how either promises or the hopes, or ideals that emerge kind of fit within the shape and structure of each book. So I think I've really enjoyed teaching a class on it this semester to my undergrad students, and for a lot of them, they are just loving it. They have not had a chance to kind of see this flow of the whole Old Testament storyline and then just kind of focus on one of those pieces and how it's fitting into a larger mission and vision. So, yeah. So, and Josh and I've talked on another podcast. It would have been a lot of fun if we could have written like for the same publisher and kind of had a launch party of Old and New Testament portraits of the Messiah. But as I read your work, Josh, I mean, you took a similar step of saying, okay, let's just focus in on the royal aspect of messianic hope here. And I found that really affirming and encouraging to have seen you kind of following a similar path.
Yeah, it's it is similar. I did something similar in that it's feels like you could if you I think you're kind of talking about some of those scholars who try to say here are promises about Jesus, everything gets melded in together about the Messiah. And so I would say that I tried to do what you did and at times struggled also in terms of knowing, does this fit under, is this like Davidic, messianic sort of royal, or, and sometimes the texts are not always easy, perfectly distinguishable. But yeah, I felt as though when I then read your book, we were definitely like-minded as well. But
yeah, and what I tell my students and others is like, there are so many ways the Old Testament points to Jesus. I mean, opening chapters of Genesis, you got, if you want to draw on John 1, you got to deal with the word speaking there. Here, right. Jesus, the God we're getting to know. We're seeing witness to Christ. And of course, the New Testament writers are drawing on passages in the Old Testament that are just talking about God really there. They're not talking about a human agent, and they apply them to Jesus. And so, but trying to lift and focus specifically on that royal bit, I think is what you and I both, it's kind of cool to see how those aligned.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
That is really fun. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Andy. And I mean, I think it's really cool. And both you and Josh have put together something really great. So thanks for y'all's contributions.
Yeah. Thank you, Madison.
I'll shift gears a little bit. And so we'll kind of move into some of the ways that what you're doing in your classroom intersects with, ministry, or what you kind of see as your contribution to the church more broadly. I think you've said some of that in talking about, conveying God to your students, and you've given us a vision for theological education, I think. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight, because it's something that I've experienced, I think that even after you went to Ridley and left me, I want to make sure I really
remind me of that again, right?
We were so happy for you, Andy. But after that, you and I continued to interact with each other at conferences. And I can say that you were one of the people that I knew was in my corner, and that you were really invested in my success and all of that. So I felt so much encouragement. So I don't know to what extent that's really intentional, or whether that's something that just flows out of you being you. But I wonder if there are some intentional things that you do to encourage young scholars around you, or even kind of students who are moving forward or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I'm encouraged to hear that, Madison. I mean, I just love, see Paul and others writing this way. I just take great joy in seeing you thrive, Madison. I mean, you're a rock star. I remember after a ETS session, I think it was Josh McNall, you were responding to one of his books. He's like, "Hey, do you know Madison Pierce?" Like, yeah, she was one of my students. I'll get any credit. No, he was like, "She is sharp." She was quoting from and so you're a great one to cheer for and encourage. I would just say, from my own standpoint, I think that Madison, I don't want to bring gender into it, but I already have. Like, you're one of how many people at ETS that were female? Just be honest. Like, you're brave, and let alone in my class. And who am I to be a scholar? God came alongside me. And I just have a heart for people trying to do what God called them to, and to be an encouragement in that. And I've tried to reach out to those. I mean, think about James. Right? When people come into church, who are you going to be like giving the prime seat? You need to think about who are the ones in need of encouragement in your midst. And I think God's given me a gift of encouragement, but I just wanted to come alongside you, Madison, and encourage you so that you could thrive. And I would just say, for any scholar who's feeling called, you're going to need people like that who believe in you, because we all feel like phonies.
Yeah,
we all do. Yeah. Especially when you're in the job market, junior dissertation, first times teaching, you're just faking it till you make it. And we need people who say, "I believe in you. Let me give you some tips of things that have helped me get to where I got." I think I remember sharing with you, Madison, my first job interview, I did horrible. I got like this conference call. I couldn't see anyone. And the head of the search committee, I guess, really liked me. And he called me afterwards. He said, "Yo, Andy, it seemed like you weren't even interested in the job, man." And I'm like, I was just trying to play it cool, this sort of thing. Like, I'm not like someone who has it all together. He's like, "Andy, you got to bring it, dude. You got to bring it in the interview. They need to see what you're going to be like in the classroom and all that." So I've had, and what was so cool about that, he's like, "So we're going to schedule an interview with you for 2 weeks from now." And right after that conversation that night, I was interviewing with Ridley. So I was ready to bring it. I got hired by Ridley. I don't even need to mess with another interview with that other school. So
that's amazing.
So I think, I'm happy to encourage others. And, I would just encourage people to, as they're thinking about their vocation and contribution, that we're all gifted differently. And some of us are more pastoral in nature. Others aren't. Some are more technicians. Others are bigger, but we're all different, and so learning to affirm each other in our, even though have different gifts, I think is so important. And that's why you don't want to build a faculty where everybody has the same gifts and are all historically oriented or all only canonically oriented or all this way or that way. It's great to learn to value what one another are doing. And so I'd encourage younger scholars that there can be a place for people with a range of gifts and so forth. I'm a jock. I talk like a jock. I heard one professors say I kind of have an athletic presence in the classroom or something like that. I'm like, I'm just, and, but I hear, but little did I know God would bring me to Wheaton College, where I have athletes in my classes, and I get to invest in these athletes, or I have had different health challenges, and I can encourage those who are struggling with different issues, and God will use all of that in different ways. And He wants us all to be faithful with who He's made us to be.
Thank you so much, Andy. I certainly didn't mean for you to say kind things about me, but I do really appreciate you affirming me yet again. So thank you so much.
I'll come back anytime. I got a lot of encouragement for you, Madison. I'm a big fan. So and I can't wait to read your book, Madison. I mean, that for the Trinity, to see Father, Son, and Spirit. Yeah, I mean, I cannot wait to have a look at that. So,
thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. That's love hearing your wisdom and just pastor's heart. So this has been a lot of fun. We kind of want to start asking this question of maybe all of our guests, but you as a TEDS alum twice over. Last question, do you have any sort of hopes, for TEDS? And you can be as general or specific, answer it any way you want, but you have a vested interest, right? And I've heard you talk about how much you love TEDS and you want to see it thrive. You want to see it do well. Do you want to take a minute just to sort of share with us some of your hopes for Trinity?
Yeah, I would just reiterate what you just said. And let me tell you, Josh and Madison have not asked me to come on to plug TEDS. They haven't. But when I meet with students, like TEDS is the place I want them to go within evangelicalism. Balance of careful training and closely reading text, but also cultural engagement. And I think that in this next season for the church, we need a generous spirit where we're not just locked into one kind of branch of evangelicalism, but learning to have that sort of generosity and unity that comes around Christ, even though there may be different particulars of outworking of doctrines that may look different. So I think TEDS has been great, and Josh and Madison and Michelle Knight and others. I mean, y'all are awesome. So I'm happy to recommend students for you. So my hope, really for TEDS is that the floodgates would open and every student would just come and see how awesome y'all are. And I would just affirm and hope that what I'd hope will remain central is this careful reading of the scriptures that God has given us. And where I would hope that TEDS would continue to grow is how this intersects with encountering the living God. We have seen a lot of failures in evangelicalism in the last however many years, moral and otherwise. And I think that shaping our character, real encounters with God, where we're not just saying, hey, I figured out how to do exegesis, or I've been able to trace from Old Testament to the New Testament. I mean, those are great, but how about cultivating a spirit where you're meditating and delighting on and obeying the God who's speaking to you through these texts? So that's where I would kind of encourage TEDS to go, but also the churches that these students are a part of, to really invest their lives in their spiritual formation amidst their time of studying at TEDS, to kind of go along with what TEDS is doing. So that would be where my heart is for TEDS. And I hope it keeps so international. It's an amazing place, the international students y'all attract, and really proud to be an alum. And I got married in TEDS, the chapel there on campus too. So I've got a lot of roads back to TEDS. So.
Oh, that's great.
Love it.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. It has been just our pleasure and delight to be able to have you on the podcast. Thanks for spending some time with us today.
Yeah.
Hey, it was great spending time with both of you, Madison and Josh.
All right. Well, that's just the foreword, everyone. Be sure to check out Andy's work. For example, you could find a great resource for students, pastors, and scholars if you're looking for a good book on Isaiah called The Book of Isaiah and God's Kingdom, published with InterVarsity Press. Or another book we talked about, check out his book co-authored with Greg Goswell, God's Messiah in the Old Testament, published by Baker. And if you really love the conversation and you want to be like Andy, why not do what he did and come study here with us at TEDS? I want to thank you, Dr. Abernethy, for joining us today for a great conversation. Thanks to my incredible co-host, Madison Pierce. And thanks to our listeners, of course. And a big thanks, as always, to our producer, Curtis Pierce. I want to thank our graduate assistant and friend, Lauren Januzik. Signing off now, I'm Josh Jipp.
And I'm Madison Pierce. Thanks again, Andy. Bye, y'all.
See you.
Foreword is a podcast hosted by faculty at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. The views expressed by the hosts and guests of Foreword do not necessarily represent the views of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. You can subscribe to our newest episode on your preferred podcast app or at forewordpodcast.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Foreword Podcast to get updates and additional links to content. Trinity Evangelical Divinity School is located 25 miles north of Chicago with extension sites across the country and online. Trinity educates men and women to engage in God's redemptive work in the world by cultivating academic excellence, Christian faithfulness, and lifelong learning. You can find more information at teds.edu.